Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the People's Law School. This is an effort by the Alabama Association for Justice, formerly known as the Trial Lawyers Association, to present to you the best lawyers in America, to educate you on our legal system. Tonight, it's no exception. Our next speaker, Archie Lamb, is a nationally and, in fact, internationally recognized attorney. Let me tell you just a little bit about Archie Lamb, what he has done. He's practices law in Birmingham. He was one of the original tobacco lawyers. We all know what happened in that instance. Thereafter, he took on the HMOs, the healthcare providers, and he has, and I will tell you, spoke to the People's Law School for many years, and each year, for those of you who remember, he has told us what he's doing, and he's predicted what he's going to do, and he's delivered. Against the HMO companies, I want you to know that he hit several of them, he and the 100 lawyers that he led throughout the nation for $2 billion a couple of years ago, and changed their practices, and as a result made, at least in theory, the health cost cheaper. Thereafter, he took on the pharmaceuticals. They called PBMs, those who controlled the pharmaceutical prices. Thereafter, there was Vioxx. We all are familiar with that litigation. And now he represents some of the people that have been taken advantage of in the financial crisis on Wall Street. He represents several people who were taken advantage of by Mr. Madoff and others like him. Let me also mention that he is involved in a case in Puerto Rico involving a price-fixing scheme wherein, well, he'll just have to tell you about it. It involves our commerce with the island of Puerto Rico. But it is an honor and a privilege for me to present to you Archie Lamb. He has spoken in many venues and arenas, including CNN and such noteworthy outlets. And I want you to know that his next project, apparently he's getting involved in, is that in Wall Street. And tonight he's going to tell us a little bit about it. It is my honor and privilege to present to you Archie Lamb. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Alan. It's great to be here, and I appreciate AAJ and the folks here in Huntsville that give us the chance to see old friends and talk about issues that are important to you. I do want to, and Janine, if you can put up, first of all, this is Janine Boyd. Janine's been my executive assistant for how many? 10 years. And she was a little girl when she came, and she's got two beautiful children and a lovely family, and we share that. I've got 4 daughters, as some of you know, and I'm delighted that she could be here to help us, because usually she does all the work back at the office, and I get to go to court and talk to the juries, and she's wondering what's going on. So this is a real opportunity, and I want to tell Janine how much I appreciate her, and I'm happy that she's here. A couple of things I want to talk to you about ahead of time. As Alan said, we have some new litigation. As many of you know, I'm also an NFL player representative and represent D'Amico Ryans and Carlos Dansby as the, among others. We represent about 10 young men who are in the league. We do not represent Andre Smith, nor are we guilty of any rumors of misconduct. I do think that today it's timely to say that it's a tragedy that Andre did not really get the advice and counsel that he should have gotten. He's an amazing young man, an amazing talent. It's my hope and prayer that he and his family will get it sorted out, because he has immense talent, and as you all know, the kind of money that those kids make in the league can change families forever. Andre comes from a humble beginning, and as I said, I hope he finds the right people to help and guide him. But it is an interesting time in the NFL, and to the extent there are questions later that you want to chat about, I'm happy to do that. Alan did mention the HMO case that we talked about many years ago has pretty much come to an end. We're in the final stages of that. The pharmacy issue remains to be an issue. With the change in administration and the change in Congress, I think you can expect some real emphasis on health care benefits, pharmacy benefits, issues related to Social Security, solvency, and those kinds of things. I think there's some real change that will benefit consumers. It's too early for us to talk about it, too early in the administration. I know we have people from all walks of life and all political bents, and it's not my desire to get into that, but I think it is going to be an interesting time as we go forward with regard to health care. 6 years ago, the doctors in Puerto Rico, I'm fortunate enough to represent several state medical societies, California, Texas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. And as a result of those relationships in Puerto Rico, I've been hired, along with my co-counsel in Puerto Rico, a local family law firm. Eric Keck Glass is the lead counsel in that case, hired by a number of companies in Puerto Rico to represent them in what's called a Jones Act cabotage case. And just to be brief, and once again, this is just given for your edification if there are questions later, we represent a number of companies that were the victims of a price-fixing scheme, where the 4 companies that are licensed to ship from the mainland to Puerto Rico got together and artificially created a price in excess of the market price, to the great detriment of the people and business people of Puerto Rico. And that is an antitrust case. I'm honored to have been appointed lead counsel on the settlement negotiation of that case, and it is a case that's just recently been sent to San Juan by the multi-district litigation panel. Again, for those of you that are return visitors, you understand that the federal districts will assign to a certain single district court when there are multiple cases filed, and we're looking forward to litigating that case. But tonight, as I was sitting, the things I've just talked about in the last 10 minutes, 5 minutes, are what I was going to talk to you about for 50 minutes tonight. And as I was thinking about coming up here and the issues, the kinds of issues that we've talked about over the years, the pressing issues of the time, as opposed to just lawsuits in general, my involvement with a coalition of lawyers who are involved in the Bernie Madoff scandal and the loss of $50 billion of investors was sort of burning a hole in my psyche in terms of what I'd like to talk to you about. So, and as I got into that, there were some issues related to the general financial collapse. And let me say this, I do not present myself as an expert in stocks or bonds or the economy relative to economics. I'm not a statistician. I'm not a mathematician. I'm not a quantitative analysis person. But I am a U.S. citizen, and I got 4 daughters, and my 27-year-old daughter is pregnant, 3 months pregnant with a baby, and so as all of us do, Democrat, Republican, or Independent, we worry about the future. And what I'd like to share with you tonight is some substantive information based on the research I've done, throw some thoughts out there. I've tried to take, as many of you know, I have an opinion that you may disagree with, but I try very hard to listen to both sides and present issues that are not partisan in nature, maybe consumerist in nature, but not partisan in nature. And I think that this is going to be hopefully edifying to you and give you some information, at least some resources that you can use to sort of figure out how it affects you. Because indeed, the crisis on Wall Street, as we all know, particularly if we travel at all, you guys are a little insulated in Huntsville because of the defense contractor economy and those kinds of things. Birmingham's a little insulated because of the medical economy, but I travel lots of places, and there are lots of communities from Fort Myers, Florida, to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Indianapolis, and Minneapolis that I've been just in the last 3 or 4 weeks that are suffering greatly from the practical effects of mistakes that a few people made, frankly, in my opinion. So what I want to talk about is what happened on Wall Street, the impacts you will see on Main Street all over the United States, and bear with me because, as I said, I'm not a scholar in this area at all, but I can read. So with that said, let's talk a little bit about just the stock market in general. The stock market, as you know, and some of these themes are going to be interesting because whether it's healthcare, whether it's pharmaceuticals, whether it's product liability, or whether it's the stocks and bonds and financial markets in this country, we're going to have similar, and I'm not going to tell you yet, it's going to be a bit of a surprise, the solution to the problems are similar, albeit very complicated on a case-by-case issue. So let's start, first of all, with what is the stock market and who oversees the stock market. The Securities and Exchange Commission was created by basically two acts back in 1933 and 1934, arising out of the Great Depression. In fact, really, they were enacted in the height of the Depression. The great market crash, of course, happened in 1929, but legislation, after interviews, they didn't have C-SPAN, but we've seen kind of the type of testimony and perusal of the issues and interrogation that probably happened in exactly the same way by the exact same committees in the legislature. And out of that came the Securities and Exchange Commission with a single mission, really. They had many entities they were to oversee, including auditor firms, accounting firms, and of course the securities firms that were the source of the great crash of the stock market and the misconduct that related there. And so they were given tools. They were given tools of oversight. They were given tools of enforcement and many other tools. In your handout, you've got a chart of the different committees and subcommittees, and you can look at that yourself. The bottom line is their charter was to protect the investor through oversight, scrutiny, checks and balances, with the interest of the consumer, investor in mind, sometimes institutional, of course, but looking at investors and being sure they weren't lied to, cheated, misled, and so forth. They had the authority and were given authority by Congress to issue new rules, new recommendations, new enforcement provisions, because in the wisdom of the Founding Fathers, the Constitution and those documents were living, breathing, and recognized that you can't write a law to cover everything. So same thing with the Securities Act, and then in 1933, the Exchange Act in 1934, they sought to address the biggest problems retrospectively that had caused the crash in 1929. One of the things that I find interesting is they've had this debacle in the securities industry now, that we'll talk about in greater detail. But if you'll recall, Anderson, in the accounting debacle in the last few years, fortunately for the people of Anderson Consulting, they spun out of Anderson, started Accenture, and when the great crisis of conflict of interest that occurred between the accountants and the auditors, Accenture prospered and became a very successful independent firm. And we're going to find some of the same overlapping issues of conflicts of interest when we get into the banking industry, when certain laws were repealed that blurred the lines between an investment bank and a commercial bank. So that's one of the things that kind of struck me as I was putting together this talk. It seems as though we're talking about HMOs and hospitals and pharmacy benefit managers and the same old story where in the day, there were fiduciary obligations that were respected and understood. There were overseers independent from the profiteers. And let me say this, again, like I say every year, I am a free enterprise guy. I want people to make as much money as they can through honest and decent means, and I think we should encourage creativity and the things that make the entrepreneurial spirit of the United States make us the most special country in the world. But there's always, it seems to me, and to some of my friends that keep hearing me say this, there is the fox guarding the hen house recurring theme that seems to be at the core of how come I keep coming up with stuff to talk to you all about. And so, with that said, those are the general obligations, promises, and charters that the Securities and Exchange Commission was given back in the 30s. Another important player in our economy is the Federal Reserve. It's a central banking system in the United States. It was created in 1913. It sort of is a quasi-governmental, a lot of private management. It's a massive bureaucracy. Ben Bernanke, who we've seen countless times in the last year, is the chairman of the board of the Federal Reserve System, and the Fed will have a role that we'll talk about as we go through sort of the evolution of the disaster, and they have an important role. It's interesting. What I tried to do here is first of all, we are post stock market crash. We are post bursting of the subprime housing bubble. We are post Madoff, and as is always the case, you're going to find people that are a lot smarter today than they were in February of 08 or February of 07. Okay? No question. No question. No question. But what I'm talking about, that is the real tragedy. What I'm talking about is people attempting to assess blame. Okay, on why did it happen, who had the obligation, and what's difficult for all of us sometimes is to ferret through hidden agenda. In other words, you know, politics is so interwoven, and political agenda are so interwoven into these issues. What I really wanted to do when I came to present to you today is give you a little bit of both, you know, a little bit of the Wall Street Journal, a little bit of the New York Times, you know, and let's work together through the facts from different people's perspective that are, at least for me, way smarter than me, way more sophisticated than me, that don't really have a dog in the fight. Okay, in other words, journalists with whom I know and I know have great journalistic ethics, who are seeking to find out information that we can all understand so that we can vote next time, you know, maybe a little bit more educated. We can invest perhaps a little more prudently and those kinds of things. So I'm going to give you some perspectives. Some more liberal, some more conservative, but I think, at least as I ferreted through it, there's some credibility that sort of overlaps, and I think that's really what we ought to do, is educate ourselves on both perspectives and try to find some credibility. As is always the case when you talk about regulation, there are economic theorists who have philosophies based on economic theory, and then you have people really in the pits who are making tens of millions of dollars, who may have a perspective based on continued profitability, not a bad thing, just a fact. You have victims who are defrauded, who have a perspective on how come it happened to them when there's supposed to be protections. And so I want to talk about some of the facts of what I perceive as the biggest problem here, and that is there were regulations and obligations for oversight that in some way were neglected or done inappropriately that allowed these things to happen to innocent people. And I'm not, that is not a political issue in my opinion. That's a fact. I can promise you that the victims of the Madoff scandal don't care whether he was a Democrat or a Republican. You know, that's not really the issue, and I don't think the resolution of the problem is a partisan issue either. But when Clinton came into office, and one of the things that many people say about Clinton, and I'm not a particular fan of Bill Clinton, but one of the things that people will say of President Clinton is he was a good president for the economy. The economy prospered under Clinton. Now, was that because of the Congress? I don't want to get into that debate either. I am not here to blame anybody. What I will say is that Clinton and certain other people not in the Democratic Party, but in the economic realm of hierarchy, the Fed and other places, were Volcker is the name I'm trying to remember. Volcker was a person that advocated regulation, not regulation in general to take over the economy, but on certain riskier investments and loopholes in the system that Bernie Madoff exploited. There should be some regulation, some accountability, some scrutiny that did not exist in the Exchange Act or the Securities Acts of 33 and 34. They wanted additional rules, regulations, oversight, punishment, show me your books, don't be allowed to hide. And that was pushed back by Greenspan. Bob Rubin, who was actually President Clinton's guy, was also anti-regulatory. He's now got a nice job in the investment banking business. He's executive officer of Citigroup. We're against heightened auditing, heightened scrutiny, heightened regulation on the sketchier parts of the economy. It's interesting, and I'm just going to go through this from a historical perspective. In 1987, the Reagan administration appointed Alan Greenspan as chairman of the Fed Reserve. He was an anti-regulator, and he snubbed Clinton's proposal for financial regulations, even in some of the sketchier areas. In 1999 is an important thing to happen because the Glass-Steagall Act was repealed. Now, this is after a $300 million lobbying effort by the banking and financial services industries to repeal Glass-Steagall, and we're going to talk about that. The purpose of Glass-Steagall, which was enacted right after the Great Depression, was meant to curb the excesses and address conflicts of interest. And we're going to talk a lot about conflicts of interest, as we have in many of these other crises. So instead of heightening credit requirements, and I apologize for reading, but I don't want to misstate what happened when that law was repealed under the encouragement and active involvement of Senator Phil Gramm from Texas. The Glass-Steagall Act had long separated commercial banks from investment banks. The repeal of Glass-Steagall blurred the difference between the two. And if I can just give you an analogy, just as Anderson Consulting had its CPAs and consultants on business side, and the consulting side, the taking advantage of opportunities in business, that is what caused the conflict. In other words, you had the investment guys pushing the auditing guys to audit less aggressively so they can make a better deal on the business side. When they blurred the lines between the investment bankers, who were investors, and the commercial bankers that turned us down for the mobile home in 1966 if my mama wanted so bad because, you know, we didn't quite have the money yet. When those two philosophies merged, and we'll talk about it some more, the conservative philosophy lost. That is what we lost when Senator Gramm was successful in repealing Glass-Steagall. So instead of heightening credit requirements, lenders decreased borrowers' decreased qualifications to qualify for a loan. And this was in 1999, so you didn't really see the effects immediately. And so what happened is the SEC stepped in and tried to create a valuation of these companies that were involved in investing, and they created the VAR, which is I'm not a mathematician and I'm no expert in it, but it became a tangible dollar value that on 99% of the time an investment would make. Some say 95, but it was something that could be reduced to something tangible so that you could sell it. It wasn't so much internally it was important, although it was used that way in some ways to delude some of the insiders, but it's really more of a marketing tool as the investment banks and the commercial banks got more aggressive in terms of marketing. It was a tool they could use to market safety and disguise risk globally in a lot of different areas. And the reality is, in retrospect, it was whatever they wanted it to be. Now, these are brilliant people, not evil people, but because of certain conditions that existed that we'll talk about, short-term incentives, if you will, it was easily manipulable based on whose perspective was being advanced. Another important event were tax cuts to the wealthy in June of 2001. This was important because it was touted to spur investment. In retrospect, it did not. It hit the top level people. It was a bit of a Reaganomics attempt to trickle down to the rest of the economy, and that ended up, at least from the initial perspective, not having the effect of stimulating the investment. It did not have much effect at all in terms of stipulation. Now, this is a perspective. I'm going to tell you this. One of the perspectives is Warren Buffett's perspective. Okay, but before I get to Mr. Buffett's perspective, I found a noted Nobel laureate, a professor at Boston University, at Columbia University, to be quite eloquent and frankly even tempered on the issue, and I wanted to share his perspective. His name is Joseph Stiglitz. I take this from a January 2009 Vanity Fair article to talk about the five key, in his perspective, the five key elements of the ultimate disaster that we were dealing with. He talked about removal of Volcker and the installation of Greenspan. He talked about the fact that Greenspan presided over two financial bubbles. One, as we'll all remember, was the internet crash, the high-tech bubble, they called it. And then the subprime lending bubble, the one that really is, in many people's opinion, got us in the mess now. They say that, of course, the current problems in our financial system are not solely the result of bad lending. Banks have made mega bets on one another. Again, it is the opening of the global financial market without the checks and balances of commercial conservatism on lending and the aggressive attack of and mega bets on fiscally irresponsible investments without looking at that 1%. They used the VAR, remember, the 95 to 99%. This is what happened yesterday is probably going to happen today, maybe a little more. What it didn't take into account is, and this is the criticism of Nassim Taleb, who's a notorious critic of the VAR, who says that you've got to look at the potentiality on honest terms of the potential catastrophe. You have to take into account Katrina is possible. You have to take into account 9/11 is possible when you're in this marketplace. You have to be looking for what he calls the black swan. That's the name of his book, and I recommend it to you because it's interesting and illuminating. And if you're a fan of the guys that make $33 billion a year in bonuses at the stock market, I would advise against reading it. But it certainly is fascinating. He's controversial. It's certainly not mainstream, but it's interesting reading. The big problem were credit swap derivatives that we'll talk about and mortgage-backed derivatives. And the bottom line is, I've read this a lot and I can't understand it, so let me just tell you what I think it means. The bottom line is a derivative is based on the risk of the contract underlying it. Okay? And so the bet on subprime lending that got Countrywide Financing in trouble and led to the downfall of Lehman Brothers and the collapse of Bear Stearns and forced them into the merger, was these two highly risky, ridiculously leveraged, unleveraged investment things were part of a portfolio of what once had been highly respected, conservative people on whom all of us in America and in the world relied on because we were the people that invented credibility, stability, integrity in the markets. And so they created a complete seduction of themselves And we'll talk about how come in a minute, but I think you probably already know. The other area that created huge problems is the area relative to conflicts of interest just disappeared. Just disappeared. You know, a conservative banker in Monroeville, Alabama, is a branch of, fill in the name, and he gets a call from New York saying, we got to move on this. You got to lend that money to that person. In fact, that whole community. And books of business like that were built all over the country based on short-term incentives and ignoring the conflicts of interest that had protected this country over the 50 to 60 years prior. The other thing, and there are a bunch of things, the other thing that's weighing in now is Enron and the accounting, the accountants ignoring general accepted accounting principles and being driven. So you got the banks being driven, you got private industry being driven, you got accounting and auditing issues being totally obliterated in the 80s, late 80s and 90s. And they faked the numbers. And that's why Sarbanes-Oxley came out. And stock options were created for CEOs and others to circumvent Sarbanes-Oxley stock manipulation obligations and potential prosecution of CEOs for fixing the books and those other kinds. They had a positive effect, but in the bottom line, you know, these guys were too smart to be too smart and too loose and too fast to be policed by a bureaucracy as Congress was. They passed the law to fix last year's problem, but those guys were 2 years ago going on to next year's problem. So Greenspan, Larry Sumner's, and Bob Rubin were adamant that regulation of these issues were not relevant, even in spite of the problems related to Enron and others, and the gambling continued. Failures of U.S. banks and financial institutions due primarily to exposure to securities of packaged subprime loans and credit default swaps rapidly evolved into a global crisis where banks failed and faith in the U.S. Stock market plummeted, and the Standard & Poor's fell more than 20% in that week. Another part of the problem relative to conflicts of interest is that a lot of faith was put into the ratings established by Standard & Poor's and Moody's, because they were the ultimate check. They were the Better Business Bureau. You know, this guy just came by and he's got this marshland in Naples, but it's really in the ocean. You know, has anybody else complained about him? Well, what they didn't disclose is Standard & Poor's and Moody's are paid by the people they're rating. I just think these people write better than I talk, so let me just say what they said. The incentive structure of the rating agencies is also perverse. Agencies such as Moody's and S&P, Standard & Poor's, are paid by the very people they're supposed to grade. The rating agencies, like the investment banks who were paying them, believed in financial alchemy. that F-rated toxic mortgages, and toxic mortgages are those subprime, that's another term of art, of the subprime loans where someone that makes $20,000 a year buys a $180,000 a year home that they can never pay for. That's really the reality of what we're talking about. And they package those up and sell them for, let's say they get 10 of those, 1.5 million, and they sell it on the open market for 5 million, and here we go. All based on people that maybe can pay $100,000, you're up to 5 million. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But that F-rated toxic mortgages could be converted into products that were safe enough to be held by commercial banks and pension funds. The flawed incentive structures is something that we'll talk about later, but the inadequate regulatory system is where we now begin to get into how could Bernie Madoff have done what he did. That's really the backdrop against which we'll talk about Madoff. But the terrifying thing is the actual fiscal condition of our economy today, because we are no longer Atlanta, New York, Chicago, St. Louis, Phoenix, LA, and Seattle. We're in Vienna, we're in Munich, we're in Tokyo, we're in Beijing, we're in Santiago, Buenos Aires, all of them depending on, too late, but depending the last 10 years on our credibility, our integrity, our oversight and scrutiny. So what does Warren Buffett say? What he basically said relative to the subprime mortgage boom is that it was a tsunami waiting to happen. I mean, there was no 5 years ago he said this is a disaster. It'll bring down the entire economy. He criticizes Greenspan's driving interest rates down, making it easy to flood the market with cash, to pay for, listen, to pay for bad investments, to pay for the subprime. Listen to this. Derivatives that we're talking about, the mortgage, subprime mortgage and the equity swap, grew from $100 million in 02, from $100 trillion in 02. I'm old. In 2007, I want you to listen to this, $516 trillion of risk. It affected trade deficits with China and destroyed the value of the dollar. It made our reliance on foreign oil, put us in a position where we had to pay cash for oil, and there was not a debt incurred. So they're in good shape. All based on this premise of safety and security because of our SEC, our Fed, our government, all of our government, anybody in office on either side of the aisle, failed to recognize, take advantage of the obvious shortcomings of the market. So the next thing I want to talk about is the bailout, because that, we heard so much about that, and what does that mean, and who got treated how, and so forth. And I thought it was interesting to find that Bear Stearns, who ultimately agreed at a bargain basement price to be purchased, quote, merged by J.P. Morgan Chase at $10 a share, which really they didn't have to pay because the Fed guaranteed the $29 million it took to so they got Bear Stearns for nothing. What's interesting about that is all the other guys hated Bear Stearns. The managers weren't Yale and Harvard educated. They came from all over the place. They were proud of the fact they were tough kids from Brooklyn or Paris, Texas, or came from University of Alabama and Oklahoma State, and they had that sort of cowboy way of rankling the establishment in the investment banking industry, which is a very closed club, very closed membership, makes Augusta look like East Lake Public Golf Course. So Bear Stearns got their comeuppance by not getting help from the Federal Reserve and not getting bailed out. Lehman Brothers was even worse. And what happened with Lehman Brothers, and I forget exactly, somebody help me, the LMTC bailout in the early 90s. Yeah, 98, okay. Well, what happened is all the other investment houses, at the request of the Fed, ponied up to help bail them out because, and at risk was $5 billion. They thought that $5 billion in 1998, we're talking about 516 trillion, $5 billion in 1998 would ruin the global economy. So they all ponied up, and Lehman Brothers said, we ain't doing it. Well, 10 years later, they needed a bridge loan from the people. They said, see you two. And they're out of business now just because those guys could do it. I mean, they just have amazing power. Merrill Lynch, of course, sold to Bank of America. The Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac is really amazing. It's an amazing story all by itself, just the evolution and incredible success that they had under Jim Smith. Jim, what's his name? Jim. He was, amazing. They did great things, got to an amazing position of power, and then overreached. And there was huge conflict between the investment houses on Wall Street and the mortgage companies outside the government, and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who had all the benefits and credibility of the government, subsidies by the Fed, but also private employees that made millions and millions of dollars. So they had the Wall Street salary with the quasi-governmental perks, and these guys in the private sector or the public sector who were head of the private sector hated them. It sounds like a soap opera, doesn't it? So when they got a chance in 08, the government duped the leadership at Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, and took control of those two quasi-governmental entities. So the government now owns them. I've been talking to y'all for a long time. I've been practicing law for over 20 years, and AIG is without question the global insurance giant of the world. And their bailout is something that I didn't really understand, because I always thought that AIG had all the money and all the assets and everything in the world. So I really dug into this one and realized this. AIG, like everyone else, had been duped in the credit swap fiasco, the derivatives, packaged them, sold them, bad investments. Not as much in the subprime mortgage, but some. But the government did a really smart thing, in my opinion, by lending AIG $85 billion. First thing I'll tell you is they lent them the $85 billion to bail them out in mid-08. They only owe $40 million now. They've already paid back $45 billion. Now, I don't know what our deal with the government is, but they're about to make a ton of money for the percentage of AIG they got for that $85 billion. The only thing I'll tell you is take some level of confidence that the people that are running the deal at the top, and I'm talking about Bernanke and Paulson and those guys, are not dumb. And I think Tim Geithner is going to do a good job. So there is money to be made in this crisis, so long as you recognize you got to take the hit where you got to take the hit in those derivatives that are high risk. The good thing AIG had is they had good business, property and casualty insurance, and many other investments, as you can see, that run the gamut, that were great money-making opportunities. And so I think that was a prudent decision to bail those guys out, because we, the people, can make our money back. It still remains to be seen about the investment banks. It's really an interesting. I encourage you to read the Journal and the New York Times over the last 12 months. Any op-eds or other pieces done by the great reporters at both newspapers giving you the details. So the corrupting influences is really, it's interesting how the further along we get away from the terminology of deceit and misleading and stocks and options and derivatives and you really get down to the bottom line, and that is the corrupting influences that exist even today in our financial markets are a grave concern and should be to all of us. We can disagree about what to do about it, but there's no question that they're ignoring whistleblowers such as Markopoulos. I forget, there's another guy similarly situated. But the point is this, and this is Markopoulos' submission to the SEC in 2005 that had the Securities and Exchange Commission acted on it and had their enforcement division done something about it. Much of the money is gone, don't get me wrong. Much of the money is gone. But a lot of money could be saved had they acted. And in fact, this guy really warned them enough in 1999. Did we put this in there, Jay? Okay. I will make sure that Alan gets, I'll make sure you get this. It's amazing. And the red flags and the detail. And I think this is the one where he didn't put his name on it because he's afraid of his life, afraid for his life. It's an amazing thing. I will tell you, and I'm going to jump to something real quick because I've only got about 10 minutes because I find this fascinating. The SEC did nothing, okay, in 05, in 99, 05, or 07, based on Mr. Markopoulos, who is an accomplished economist and statistician. He knows what he's talking about. They did nothing. Yeah.
They even replied to him, or did they just ignore him?
They ignored him. Well, he had some conversations with some of them. Yeah, but they didn't call Madoff. A couple of things I want to tell you here. First of all, in 2006, Wall Street bonuses, $33.9 billion. In 2007, $33.2 billion. In 2008, when all this stuff is out there, they still give them almost $20 billion to each other. And I'm for people making a ton of money. It's not about a ton of money. It's for a collapsed economy, stock market crash, and still $20 billion of bonuses, performance bonuses being given over a completely failed proposition, not to mention what investors had suffered. Another thing that's crazy is the last 4 enforcement division chiefs of the Securities and Exchange Commission, when they were finished with their term, took primo jobs in the financial industry on Wall Street. The short-term incentives I talked about relatively early are those incentives that cause the subprime crisis to explode. Because what's happening? Commissions are being paid on the closing of the notes. Commissions are being paid on the packaging based on not the $25 million annually, but the $180,000 mortgage. Then you package them for $1.8 million. In other words, it was a completely corrupt, and I don't care who you are. You know? This was a billion and billion dollar free-for-all that they went crazy over through competition. They were fighting with each other for the deal, and I'm going to, you know, and so instead of maybe a 5-to-1 risk, it's 50-to-1. It ain't ever going to happen. And they knew it, and they knew better. And the accounting firms and the auditing firms were in it. The rating firms were in it. And All good people. I'm not talking about anybody's motive or who ought to go to jail except Madoff, okay? I'm saying the promises made in 33 and 34 were not kept. Now we're going to get a chance to try again. And one of the things that I hear is, well, over-regulation will stymie free enterprise. I'm concerned about that. I don't ignore that. I don't want, I have very close friends who are cops. One of them, great guy. One of them, not a great guy. You get stopped by the bad one, it's a problem because he's a cop. You get stopped by the good one, So, same thing here. A regulator can be bad. I'm not saying, I really don't know what I'm saying. I'm saying you ought to have rules. You ought to have regulations. Let me close. Go to the. All right, I'm going to talk through this real quick because some of the. Here's what I want to tell you. Go to SEC's failure. I want to read one thing. This is Warren Buffett. One of the reasons you never know who's swimming naked till the tide goes out. Okay, and those are words to live by. Next slide. Guess who that is? A freshman at the University of Alabama in 1957. That's his yearbook picture. I couldn't resist it. Former chairman of the NASDAQ. This is a guy with credentials, man. Go to the next one, Jay. You've got all this in your Steven Spielberg and others, tens of billions of dollars. I'm not going to get into the Ponzi scheme. Everybody here knows what that is. Mecopoulos, we've already talked about. Let me turn to that one. Ignored, tried again, ignored, 29 red flags, ignored, finally arrested. He says it was a Ponzi scheme. But one of the things I want to read you is interesting. Back on the soap opera deal. I'm hurrying, Alan. Okay. Recently, SEC Inspector General David Kotz told lawmakers he's concerned over the agency's failure to unmask Madoff, despite tips pointing to the Madoff scheme as fraudulent. And he's expanding the inquiry called for last month by Chairman Christopher Cox. He will also look at the relationship between former SEC Attorney Eric Swanson, who was an enforcement department person who investigated Madoff in 1999 and 2004, but who's married to Madoff's niece. There are other Madoffs out there, if we go to the next slide, and I encourage you to read about Alan Stanford's $8 billion scam that took in Johnny Damon of my beloved Yankees. And finally, the answer is, as it was in our problem with health care, our problem with pharmaceuticals, our problem with just about anything in this country. It's a great country, and I'm for free enterprise, so long as you have these fundamental elements, that you have transparency. Where's the money going? What are you doing with my money? Who's doing what with my money? What's their track record? Who else is out there that I might go to if I don't like you or what you're doing? Transparency in the system. Regulatory enforcement with teeth. A lot of the problem is that the SEC doesn't have adequate funds to prosecute, to investigate. Even though Eric maybe wasn't looking that hard because he was married to Shana, if there was an independent good investigator, did he have adequate resources, adequate funds to do the type of investigation necessary? And if not, as we've done in the Homeland Security Act, there are a lot of those laws that overreached. I don't defend all of them, but the Congress has the authority. Congress has the authority to enact legislation that can bring, it is complicated, and I'm not smart enough to be a stockbroker today, but it's not like people aren't trained and educated and experts available to educate the overseers and the police policing of these industries to protect people from liars and cheaters and scammers. These are not close calls. This is not an almost. This is tragic, catastrophic, crippling. And there ought to be accountability for everybody, you know. Let's be honest. A lot of this is a result of our corrupt campaign finance system, where the legislators are disincentivized to police the wealthy. It's not complicated. I mean, there's a reason that a Republican Congress and a Democratic Congress over the last 20 years didn't do jack. And it's not because it's not, I mean, we've been here 57 minutes. I think it's unanimous. This is bad. This is cheating. I mean, what's going on? Well, I think we all know what's going on. But I do encourage you. I'm hopeful that as we all move forward in a more bipartisan fashion, that we can actually put people in authority and put some teeth in legislation to protect these people. I'm involved in, quickly, a group of 4 law firms who are working with a group of European investors who were really all their life savings were stolen. These are people of immense wealth. Not that makes a difference in the lady that loses $2,000. But the good news about that is they are working together with the U.S. enforcement agencies to build a bridge with the European Oversight Committee to understand that these people will hide between countries. I mean, we are no longer, you just don't drive to Mexico anymore. It's a bigger problem. It's a bigger world. We all depend on each other and going to more and more count on each other. And I hope this has been illuminating. It was fun for me to dig into. I apologize for not being more astute, but I'm working on it. And to the extent you have questions, I'm happy to stay after and let me just stay after and answer your questions. And I appreciate y'all having me. Getting this back.